Good evening all, and welcome. We really have had something special happen today. Yesterday, I put out the poll for which stories you'd like, and work stories won, so I made the video. And today, as I'm going through some stuff, I noticed that Hitchhikers overtook it after the video came out. So, this is the only time it's ever happened. I thought I'd make this video as well. If Followed Home somehow makes a huge comeback and wins again, that would be insane, but I doubt it. Anyway, my wife has just launched a new video on her channel, and it would mean the world to me if you could please check it out after this one. But for now, it's time to stay comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was a teenager, I lived in a small town located about 30 miles south of Atlanta, Georgia. I did not get my driving license or my first car until I was almost 20 years old. So between the ages of 16 to 19, I hitched frequently. This was in the early 70s, when people still hitchhiked, and many drivers were still willing to pick people up, in spite of the dangers and risks posed to both drivers and riders. For the most part, I never had any trouble with people who offered me rides, but occasionally, I would get picked up by someone who would totally creep me out. This is a story about one creepy ride I accepted, and how 25 years later, I would discover, to my great shock, that I may have been luckier than I ever had imagined. This incident occurred sometime in the summer of '74, when I was 17 years old. At that time, I was a 6-foot-tall, 175-pound, blonde-haired and blue-eyed guy who did not have any trouble connecting with girls for dates. In fact, my story begins with me standing on the side of a highway with my thumb out, as I was trying to get back home after spending the weekend with my girlfriend, who lived in downtown Atlanta. I was traveling south, away from the city and out of the country where I lived with my parents. I recall that I had only had my thumb out for about 15 minutes when a man in a big white Lincoln Town car pulled over. A very large and expensive car at the time, mind you. As I walked up to the car, I scanned the inside and looked at the driver, trying to size the situation up, as I always did, just to be safe. What I saw was a tidy car, with a man in the driver's seat who looked to be in his late 30s or mid-40s, dressed in an expensive suit and tie. He had short black hair, wore black rimmed eyeglasses, and appeared to be rather on the thin side, with a gaunt face and dark eyes. I never learnt his name, but for the sake of the story we will call him Town Car Man. When I got up into the passenger side of the car, I leaned down towards the open window and told him where I was heading and asked if he was going that far, to which he replied that he was, in a soft voice. I was not at all wary of him, as by all appearances he was just an ordinary middle-class businessman, and I opened the door and got into the front seat next to him without any hesitation. Generally, when I accept rides from strangers while hitchhiking, I liked to try to engage them in chat, as a sort of way to pay them for the ride by providing good conversation, and also to put them at ease about picking me up by showing them that I was harmless and not a creep, even though I felt that I did not look at all dangerous. Only if you could call having long hair and dressing in the hippie fashion at the time dangerous. However, when I began trying to chat with Town Car Man in my normal fashion, with typical small talk, I instantly started getting bad vibes from him, as I could tell that he was mostly ignoring what I was saying, and instead kept trying to steer the conversation towards asking me personal questions about myself, such as how old I was, where I went to school, if I had a girlfriend. I tried to answer his questions politely as possible, without really giving away too much information. But Town Car Man kept on getting more and more personal, asking questions that hinted at whether or not I was sexually active with my girlfriend, telling me that when he was my age, he went around horny about half of the time, and had always been on the lookout for adventures, if you know what I mean. As the ride progressed, and we were getting further and further out of the country, I began to get very uneasy, and I started to sense that something was not quite right with him. We had left the populated city behind, and were now traveling down an old 2-lane highway through the countryside that was sparsely populated. There seemed to be hardly any other cars on the road. The more that Town Car Man continued to ask me questions about myself, wanting to know very personal things about me, like if I'd ever had an intimate relationship with my girlfriend, all the while glancing over at me from time to time with a sort of creepy, knowing look in his eye, as if he was privately enjoying some dirty secret that only he knew about, and I became ever more so uncomfortable. I don't know how better to describe it, and it really began to make me feel uneasy, as his manner seemed very cagey, and I totally sensed that there was some underlying motive in his questioning. It really put me on guard. I began to think about what I should do next, as in, should I ask him to pull over and let me out, even though I was only about half the way to my destination, and to be let out in the middle of nowhere? For the first time, I began to realize just how vulnerable I felt. But what made me start to feel uneasy was when he started asking me if I wanted a drink of liquor, indicating that he had several bottles with him in the trunk, and that if I wanted some, he would pull over to the side of the road and mix me up a stiff drink. Because I was growing more and more uncomfortable, I declined his offer, saying that I did not drink, which was a lie. Even at that age, I was already regularly drinking with friends. But he would not take no for an answer, and kept insisting that I really should just have one drink, because he was such a great drink mixer, and it would only take him a minute for him to fix me a very special one. After I had declined this offer for the 4th time, he abruptly changed tactics again, and began telling me a story about how when he was my age, and a young guy in the army, and how he used to hitchhike a lot too, and that he would sometimes get picked up by men who wanted to pay him money to sleep with them, and asked if anything like that had ever happened to me. By this time, I'd had quite enough of all of this, and I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, that's never happened to me, and nobody had better ever offer that to me." Well, the knowing look vanished instantly from his face, and I could tell he was totally irked by how I had just reacted to his story. That exchange between us totally changed the dynamic inside the car, and he became very quiet. After a few minutes of this uneasy silence, he spoke up and told me that he wasn't turning at the next intersection, and that I needed to get out there, even though he had told me when he first picked me up that he was going my entire way. At this point, I was very relieved, and now only wanted to get out of the car. When the car came to a stop, I had just barely gotten out the car and pushed the door closed when he stepped on the gas and zoomed off, literally jerking the handle of the car out of my hand. I remember that I stood there watching him drive away until he disappeared down the road, and that my heart was beating very fast. I was both scared and angry at what had just happened. After I had calmed down, I resumed hitchhiking until I got another ride that took me home without further incident. Fast forward 25 years. It was 1999, and I had all but forgotten about my creepy ride with Town Car Man. I'm on the internet reading through a true crime website when I stumbled onto a story about an ultra creepy guy named Robert Bennett, a man who had been arrested after a series of vicious attacks on men who he'd picked up in his car, drugged, handcuffed them, and set their genitals on fire with a flammable liquid. The attacks took place over a 20-year period, starting around 1968 in the Atlanta area and ending with his arrest in 1991. Prior to Bennett's arrest, this attacker became known as the Handcuff Man, and talk within the local gay community was that he was targeting men who he thought were gay prostitutes. When I saw the photo of Bennett that accompanied the article, my jaw literally dropped open, as the memories of my ride that day in 1974 came flooding back. I was certain I was looking at a picture of Town Car Man, and I was absolutely floored. I do not have any way to prove that creepy guy who picked me up was in fact this Robert Bennett, but the physical resemblance between what I remember about Town Car Man and the photo of Bennett is absolutely uncanny, and the persistent offer by Town Car Man to mix me a special drink, and his questions about whether or not I'd ever had sex with men for money, also seemed to indicate that possibility. I should point out that even though this story took place in the early 70s in the deep south of Georgia, I was actually okay with gay people at the time, and even knew a few people back then who were gay. So I didn't have a problem with homosexuality at all, and still don't. But being heterosexual, I had zero interest in doing that with other men. And even if I had been into that stuff at the time, I always found it highly distasteful when people assumed that they could act in such an unwanted, cagey fashion regarding sexual matters with complete strangers. I always have, and always will, find that to be extremely creepy. This happened about 5 years ago. I am a 26-year-old man, making me 21 when this event occurred. I live in southern Ohio, about 45 minutes away from Cincinnati. I went to a smaller college in the area, and I was pretty isolated from most of my friends and family during the week. My friends all went to their various choices of college throughout the Midwest, and my family remained in my hometown. I ended up at a school alone because I had a rather specific major, and this was one of the few colleges in the country that would accommodate me. Luckily, my girlfriend went to college fairly close to me, so I would often find myself making 2 to 3 trips a week to see and study with her. On most weekends, I would go on road trips to visit my friends, considering their campuses were a lot bigger and a lot more fun than my small town college. During this particular weekend in question, I was getting ready to make about a 2-hour trip to see my friend Kyle at his school, the name of which I probably shouldn't disclose. I had made the same trip about 30 times before, so I knew the route pretty well at this point, and didn't even have to use a GPS to get there. I left on Friday afternoon once I was done with classes for the day, and I was set to arrive at Kyle's dorm at around 8 p.m, right on time to go out for a night of binge drinking and eating garbage food. Oh, the joys of college. I set off at about 5:50 and was roughly 15 minutes into my trip when my girlfriend called me. This was pretty unusual considering I had already told her I was driving to Kyle's, so I answered quickly, thinking something must have been wrong. She was working that night, and her car had broken down in her dorm room parking lot when she was trying to leave to go to work for her shift. She figured I wasn't too far into my trip and wanted to know if I could give her a quick ride to work before I got too far. Me being the dutiful boyfriend I was, agreed to come and get her since I was only about 20 minutes away. I was already pretty far off campus, so I pulled over my car on the highway and used GPS to see if there was a faster route to her from where I was. The map on my phone revealed that there was an exit coming up that would take me to a side street that I could use to get to her fairly quickly. So I texted her and let her know that I was on my way and set towards my destination. I had seen the exit in question plenty of times, but I never had any reason to get off on it. So once I exited the highway, my surroundings were completely unfamiliar to me. The exit took me off onto a road that had dense wood on the right side and the highway on the left. My phone informed me the next turn wasn't for about another 5 miles, so I had a ways to go until I had to do any navigating. About a half-mile later, the road had turned, and there were now trees on either side of me, and to be honest, it was a really beautiful sight. It was October, so the surrounding woods were a mixture of various warm colors, and I actually was really enjoying my little detour. The entire area was wooded on either side, with only the occasional break in the tree line for a driveway and a mailbox to poke out. The houses were hard to see through the trees, but from the few glimpses I did manage to steal, the houses were actually pretty nice. It was getting a little dark, and I had about a mile to go before I had to turn, when I noticed a Toyota with the hood popped open further down the road. As I approached, I noticed a man in a shirt and tie with his head under the hood, seemingly with a broke-down car. There was no traffic behind me, so I stopped for a moment and asked him if everything was okay, or if he needed to borrow my phone or anything. He didn't seem to hear me at first, so a little louder this time I said, "Everything okay?" This time he seemed to have heard me, and he lifted his head up away from the engine and looked up at me. He seemed like a completely normal guy, and had a normal face to match. The best way I can describe him is pedestrian looking. He had short brown hair, brown eyes, and 5 o'clock shadow. He smiled at me and said he was on his way home from work, and that something had gone wrong with his engine. I offered him my phone in case he wanted to call anyone to get picked up, or get the car towed. He said, "Oh no, that's okay. I have a car service that will come and get my car for me. They're closed until tomorrow morning though, so I hate to ask, but could you possibly give me a ride to my brother's house? He only lives 4 minutes away from here." This absolutely should have been a red flag for me. I think I was just a little stunned by how normal this guy seemed, considering most hitchhikers on TV are crazy or are axe murderers. Why couldn't he have just used my phone to call his brother? Why couldn't he have just called his own brother with his own phone? I guess I just wasn't thinking clearly at the time, but hindsight is 20/20, and I'm well aware I made a bad decision that night. I was physically much bigger than him, and he was driving a nice car, so I figured he wasn't a weirdo or local crazy person, and that I could overpower him if need be. So I agreed to give him a quick ride to his brother's house since it was on the way to my girlfriend's, who would later be livid with me for taking so long to get her to work. But that's a story for another time. I unlocked the door for him to get in, and he pointed me in the direction of his brother's house, and we set off on our way. Things were pretty normal for a few minutes, and I was starting to feel like maybe I had done the right thing. Then, things started to get weird. The first thing that made me uncomfortable was the way he acted every time there was a swear word in the music. He was almost flinching at every time 50 Cent said something of that nature, and I picked up on it pretty quickly. So I changed the song, thinking that he was just really against swearing or something. About a minute later, I changed the song, though there was no swearing in that one. He reached up, slammed his hand on the radio power button, and turned it off. It wasn't crazy hard or anything, but it was definitely enough to get me to notice. I tried to make light of the situation and said, "Not your style?" This question was met with complete silence. At this point, I was ready for the guy to get out of my car, so I asked, "How much further do we have to go? I have somewhere to get to and I can't be late." He said we had about 4 minutes to go, which immediately sent up warning signals in my head, considering he had told me the same thing about 8 minutes ago. I decided that was enough. I didn't think he was dangerous or anything, but I figured our destination was further than he was letting on, or that he was lying, so that I would take him despite the distance. It was getting late, and I wasn't trying to face my girlfriend's wrath, so I told him this was as far as I could go, and that he would have to walk the rest of the way. His mood changed immediately, but instead of getting angry, which I was expecting, he became panicky and practically begged me to take him the rest of the way. His overreaction set off pretty much every alarm I had in my head, so I told him to remove himself from my car before I had to remove him myself. It was then he pulled out his rather oversized wallet and offered to pay me to take him the rest of the way. He tried to pull out a stack of $20 bills. As he removed them from his wallet, something else fell down onto the seat next to him. It was only a split second before he grabbed it and shoved it back into his pocket. But I got a good enough look at it for it to haunt me to this day. Along with his money, a small Ziploc bag of what I'm confident were full adult teeth fell out of his wallet. Front teeth, molars, you name it. Everyone I've told this story to has been skeptical of this part, but I'm confident of what I saw. I freaked out worse than I ever have, and screamed at him to get out of my car, and he immediately did, and was looking at me with surprised eyes on the side of the road. I took off and called the police, who simply told me to not pick up hitchhikers ever again, and that they couldn't do anything about the man since he didn't commit any crimes. I don't know where he was going, or what he was doing, and I'm pretty sure I don't want to know. I do know, however, that he seemed to have all of his teeth still in his mouth. I don't know whose teeth those were or why he had them, but creepy teeth hitchhiker? Let's not meet again. When I was 17, I worked at an indoor pool as a lifeguard. I had 2 very strange encounters while working at that establishment, but the one I am about to share certainly takes the cake. First, a little foreshadowing, as the details are important. I was dating a boy at the time who was chill as hell, and he had an absolutely crazy older brother. The way we met was mad. I was hanging out in said boyfriend's room, watching him play Kingdom Hearts, and one of his cousins bursts into the room and asks me to come to the bathroom immediately. A look of shock clearly plastered on his face. I got up and joined him outside the small bathroom. The thing that sticks with me the most was that I saw blood everywhere, and I mean everywhere. "You're a lifeguard, right?" the man bleeding over the sink asked me. Yeah," I replied sheepishly. "So you know first aid then?" "Of course." I don't know why, but then I kicked into training mode and began cleaning his bloodied hands to find the source of the flow. We'd sat in silence mostly. I was afraid to ask many questions. He was obviously inebriated anyway. I cleaned and bandaged him up to the best of my ability. Later I found out from my boyfriend that his brother had been drinking that night, along with doing some other drugs. Apparently he got pissed off and went into full rage mode and destroyed his apartment with his bare hands. Crazy, I know. Well, one day, a pretty long time after, he saw me outside while I was over one night and approached me. I was in my car adding water, and he then proceeded to tell me he really appreciated what I did for him that night, and he had to repay me somehow. He went to my driver's side and tucked something in between the door and seat and said, "Have a good night," and that was that. I was busy with my car issues and forgot about the encounter. I honestly thought it was just some good bud, but I was wrong. It was a meat cleaver. Back to the pool now. It was late fall or early winter, therefore the pools were never too crowded this time of year, and you get to know the regulars. I was befriended by a boy maybe a few years older than me, called Jack. We had a lot in common, and despite him looking like a creep, we got on well enough. He never gave me any reason to fear him. We mostly talked about music, and he commented on how mature I was for my age compared to other girls. Again, this never alarmed me, because I heard this a lot from people. 10 years on, I still do. One day it was freezing and pouring down with rain. My shift was ending soon, and Jack had mentioned he had to walk home as his ride bailed on him. I said, "The hell you are? You live close? I can give you a lift." He agreed to wait for my shift to end and hitch a ride. He told me where he lived, and I was familiar with the community. I got changed into my clothes. I wore silly goth clothes from Hot Topic. The pants were parachute and clasped, with a snap button and zipper. We left, and I headed to the community he said he lives in. As we approached, I put my blinker on, and he said, "No, keep going." Boom. Red flag. The only thing ahead past this development were fields and the occasional farmhouse. I spoke up and said, "Dude, you said you live here." He responded that it was only a little past here and that he used it as a landmark. Okay, fine. We kept going about 3 minutes, and after he said, "This is me on the left." I was somewhat relieved to see it was a cluster of wealthy-looking houses maybe 3 acres apart. Better than the center of nowhere, I suppose. We pulled into the driveway, and I noticed there were no cars, which I guess makes sense since he did say his ride bailed. I put the car in park, and he pulled my parking brake up. "What the?" I tried to say, but I couldn't because the creep grabbed my hair and forced a kiss on me. I forgot to mention this fool had a grill so yellow, he made Big Bird look white. Anywho, I was trying to bite him, pull away, and slap him, but he was much stronger than me. He forced his hand to the opening of my pants, and the snap betrayed me, and I was reaching to my left at this point, remembering Big Brother's gift. I screamed and told him to get off me, and whipped that sucker out so fast and slammed it into my steering wheel. It sliced into it all the way to the metal. The look on his face was priceless. He started to mumble and panic, not making much sense, and then he reached for my hand, so I pulled the cleaver out and blindly swung it. I had no other option. I nicked the part of his hand where the thumb joins, and he yelped out in pain. "Get the hell out," I screamed, the words trembling and barely able to escape me. He hesitated, but starting to get out, and started cussing me, calling me all kinds of colourful words. I was shaking like a leaf at this point and holding back tears. He slammed my door. I put the car in reverse and tore out the driveway. Then wham, I hit something. Hard enough to stop my car. Shit, I destroyed the mailbox. In my terror, I misjudged the driveway. He came running at me, hands up and screaming at me like, what the hell? My window was down and I heard him say, "You're gonna pay for that." I screamed, "Shove it up your butt," or something equally colourful, and got the hell out of there. I drove straight to my boyfriend's, visibly shaken and crying at this point, and told him everything. We agreed my assault with the cleaver would cancel out police involvement, so he said he was calling his brother. I only saw Jack once more at a gas station late at night, and he just glared at me. I was with friends and begged them to leave. Haven't seen him since. So Jack, let's not meet again. This happened about 6 years ago. It's a story I've told many times and will continue to tell, because honestly, it was probably the closest I've ever been to getting killed. Or if not killed, then something else really horrible. The summer of 2012, me and my best friends were hitchhiking around Eastern Europe with no money, like a bunch of crusty punk bums. We were 19 at the time and really bought into that lifestyle, but we're over it now. Without boring you with unnecessary details, we were making our way towards Poland from the Baltics and happened to hitch a lift into Lithuania at the Latvian border. The dude who picked us up was really friendly, but he was ultimately going in a different direction, and so he dropped us off at this spot that he told us was really good for hitching. He dropped us off, and it was a large concrete area by the side of a road in the middle of the Lithuanian countryside, probably designed for truckers to pull in and take a nap or whatever. On one side of the road was endless cornfields. The other side was some woods. It was pretty late in the evening, and there was no traffic anywhere, so we decided to call it a night, crossed the road towards the edge of the woods, and got out our sleeping bags, food, etc. by this small dirt mound near the road by the woods. As we were unwinding, we heard a woman screaming from across the road. We immediately ran to see what was going on, and we could just about make out two men running away in the cornfields. We stood there in shock, and a few moments later a car up the road pulled out of the cornfields and sped off into the distance. We stood there in shock, wondering what to do. Then a few moments later, a police car showed up. He asked us questions in Lithuanian, and we explained to him in English that we were just hitchhikers. He said this to us: "This is a very dangerous place. You shouldn't be here." Then proceeded to roll up his windows and drive back the way he came. We were pretty spooked at this point, so we crossed the road to our bags by the dirt mound on the edge of the woods. My friend had a crappy little rusty penknife, and we agreed to stay vigilant. It was nighttime by this point, and after a while nothing happened. We were still a bit scared, and couldn't really sleep. Then, in the dead of night, in the woods next to us, we could hear footsteps, cracking the twigs and branches of the woods. They slowly got closer and closer to us, and they eventually stopped. We heard incessant whispering for a few moments, then heard the footsteps and twigs snapping and moving slowly away from us. Neither of us needed to say anything to each other. We both knew what had happened. At this point, we were petrified, and my friend took out his crappy penknife and we just lay there bricking it, waiting. I remember saying to him, "See you in hell, Connor," and him saying it back to me. An hour or two passed, and we were still laying there taking turns with the knife, in case we got attacked from different angles, not knowing what was going to happen. After a while, nothing happened, and the exhaustion kicked in and we passed out. Suddenly, we were abruptly woken up early in the morning, as it was sunny by this stage, by the sound of a car really aggressively pulling up on the road. By the mound we were sleeping behind. We heard car doors slam and footsteps stomping towards us really quickly. As we were lying down and behind the mound, we couldn't really see them, but we could feel that they were inches away from us. I'll never forget the fear that I felt at that moment. My whole body froze, and I simply thought, this is it. They stopped, and we heard a really angry argument in Lithuanian between two men. It stopped after what felt like an eternity, but in reality was probably no more than 30 to 60 seconds. They stomped back to the car and drove off. I almost vomited with relief. We immediately got up, packed our bags, and began walking as far away as possible from that area, and started hitchhiking. We're not sure what we were privy to that night. We don't think it was sexual assault, or else there would have been more screams. Could it have been murder? The perpetrators were watching us from the woods, whispering. They were seconds away from either killing us or taking us the next morning. This happened 6 years ago, and it's still so surreal thinking that this happened, and that we got away unscathed. For all we know, we could be a pile of bones somewhere in an unknown Lithuanian forest. I'd also like to add as well, before any of this happened, there was a weird precursor. We were on the Latvian-Lithuanian border in a small village sitting on a wall. We walked past a police car with what looked like two very heavily asleep police officers, almost dead even, and some random guys shouting at them through the window. We thought it was strange and sat down on the wall. We watched the event from a distance before proceeding to roll some cigarettes. We both looked up again, and about 20 seconds later they had all just vanished. There was no sight of them anywhere, and it was a long stretch of road both ways. We both thought it was weird as hell. We hitched a lift from that wall, and it was a talking point right up until our calamity a few hours later. It kind of set off the tone for the night. I know it's an irrelevant detail overall, but I feel I should mention it anyway, because even though we weren't spooked, we were weirded out until shit got real. This takes place in October 1977, when my mum was 16. She ran away from her abusive home along with her friend Lisa. They hitched from Mass all the way to California. Obviously, this wasn't the brightest of plans, but given my mum's turbulent home life and past experiences, she didn't see how it could be much more dangerous than anything she'd already experienced. They had a pretty safe and uneventful trip across the country, finding friends in many truck drivers and other travelers. It wasn't until they reached California when this encounter happened. The hillside strangler at first was thought to be one assailant. It ended up being two men who were caught and brought to justice for 10 murders. So my mum and Lisa end up meeting these two guys who were super nice to them. They crashed at their place for a few days, partying, but nothing bad had come of it. These guys tell the girls that they're going to take them to the Hollywood Hills and Sunset Boulevard to see the sights. Not being from that area, My mum had no idea that these areas were more crime-ridden at the time, especially considering they were supposed to be sightseeing. My mum really wanted to see where all the movie stars lived. These guys take my mum and her friend to some divey restaurant/bar and get them super drunk. It's also the first time my mum is introduced and tries cocaine. After these underage girls are now completely high and drunk, they split off into pairs and my mum's friend disappears with one of the guys. My mum is now hanging out with just one of her new guy friends. He then suggests that they stand on the sidewalk of Sunset Boulevard in the middle of the night, and if/when a car pulls up, she should get in and direct the driver to drive across the street to this dark parking lot. It isn't really up until the first and only car pulls up, and she gets in, that she's realized this guy is prostituting her out. Keep in mind, these guys had been nothing but kind and respectful to my young mum and her friends the past few days. Also, and very sadly, this type of abuse is not a new concept for her either. She gets into the car, and instead of pulling into the parking lot, he keeps driving straight. My mum explains that he's going the wrong way, so he starts driving faster. My mum moves towards the door, but he locks it, hits her, and attempts to hold her down at the same time. He tells her she isn't going anywhere. My mum knew in her head she needed to get out of the car or she'd be dead. So in one swift move, she unlocks the door, tucks and rolls out the car. His car comes screeching to a halt. She sees some bushes in front of a house, so she runs and hides behind them. He's turned around looking for her, creeping along. His passenger side was facing where she was hiding, and she was peeking through the bushes, and she saw he had a gun. As soon as his car crept by, she ran to the backyard. It was all fenced in. There was no other way out, so she had to go back the way she'd came. By the time she crawled back into the bushes to see if he was still around, she saw his car had gone to the end of the road and turned back round, so he passes again. And when she thought he was far enough away, she crawled out the bushes to run. But then she sees his brake lights. Confident that he's now seen her, she runs as fast as possible around a corner. But she could hear his car, so she had to duck and hide behind parked cars on the road. As soon as he passes again, she books it across the street, which took her through the parking lot she was originally supposed to park in, and back to her friend. The creep did a circle again, but by this time she was with her friend, and they were leaving the area. My mum and her friend quickly ditched these two assholes, and did find a safer place to stay. But only a short time later, did my mum call home and eventually made it home safely. It wasn't until a long time later that she saw on the news a story about women being murdered and recognized the murderer, dubbed the Hillside Strangler, as the man who had picked her up that night. A side note, my mum literally just dictated this story to me. I've heard it before, but in not so much detail. She told me it was Kenneth Bianchi who drove the car this night. My mum said there was no questioning it. It was his distinguishing features, and definitely his moustache. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. If you did, don't forget to share, drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, sub and press the bell icon if you're new here. Like I mentioned before, my wife has launched a new video on her channel, and it would really mean the world to me if you would give it a chance and check it out. For being only 8 minutes long, it is plenty terrifying. I'll leave the decision down to you. It's on screen now and in the description. But for now, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome. Be more awesome by watching her video. And I'll see you in the next one.